Now, as the History Channel presents Inside the Mind of a Suicide Bomber. "19 people were killed in mid-June 2002 on a rush-hour bus in southern Jerusalem, blown up by a Palestinian suicide bomber who saw himself as a martyr for his cause, the destruction of Israel and the creation of an independent Palestine. He was not alone. The number of volunteers who would like to become suicide bombers often exceeds the number of bombs. 19-year-old Murad Tawalbe wanted to become one of them too.
I made plans with one of my friends. I promised him that we can go together for the same operation.
Today, he sits in an Israeli prison, arrested in August 2001 near Haifa, where he had planned to explode himself and others in a crowded market.
To become a shaheed, a martyr for fanatic Islamic groups, means that you automatically get a very good seat in paradise.
Tawalbe believes that in paradise his sins will be immediately washed away, and he will have 72 huris, or virgins of paradise, for his pleasure.
Paradise, right? It's a word which is like a garden with rivers made of milk and honey. No one can describe what's in paradise. So whatever you imagine in this life, you can get in paradise.
Going to paradise is just one of the promises Muslim fundamentalist groups like Hamas and the Islamic Jihad use to entice young men into suicide bombing.
It was a very clear way to tell both Israelis and the Palestinian leadership that we are not accepting your way of peace.
For them, the only solution is the destruction of the state of Israel.
Suicide bombing is a powerful weapon, a weapon tailor-made for the Palestinians as a way to level the playing field against the might of Israel.
Some of them are talking about suicide terrorism as the nuclear weapon. Because they don't have nuclear weapon, they use it.
The suicide bombing is a very rational and very cheap, but very wise kind of operation. Cheap because the investment is very low.
The Israelis have to understand that in a way this is a natural outcome of the everlasting occupation over Palestinians.
That occupation began after the 1967 war, when Israel took over land inhabited by 1 million Palestinians, including East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip.
When I go to explode myself, it is not because I like blood or death. Nobody likes death. Nobody likes blood. There is nobody who doesn't like peace. Look, the stiff regulations and pressures which they put on us, they made some of our people now go to bed hungry.
In the beginning, it was difficult for Islamic Jihad and Hamas to find recruits. The few they found were young unmarried men who did not fit the usual profile of a potential suicide. They weren't depressed, alcohol, or drug dependent, and didn't have a history of attempting suicide.
Suicide terrorism is not a personal phenomenon, it's a group phenomenon. The most important psychological process in making a suicide bomber is group influence, is the group process.
Mosques are ideal places where recruiters from the organization find the would-be bomber.
If they know I am the one who's going to recruit, they will come for me. I just give the message in the mosque that this is what we should do. And then people then who are ready will contact me.
Once inside the group, the bomber is prepared for his mission with ideological lectures and prayer.
The organization, Hamas or Islamic Jihad, does not want to take this risk of the volunteer with a great initial enthusiasm having second thoughts.
The organization then chooses the suicide bomber's general target area.
They want to go where there are the most people, where they can do the most damage and kill the most innocent people.
While it's very simple method, the sophistication is that this is a kind of guided bomb. The bomb has eyes and has a brain.
For Murad Tawalbeh, the explosives were provided by his brother.
I went to see him. He showed it to me. I held his hand and kissed it because he was going to give me something precious.
Then, Tawalbeh recorded a video testament like this one for distribution to the media after his death. It would be his record of success.
You always see the candidate sitting there or standing in front of the camera, always start his declaration with the words, Anna al-Shahid al-Hay, meaning I, the living martyr.
I read my verse from the Quran. A part of my will was to console my family, especially my mother, so that when she sees on television that I was a suicide bomber, she will know that she shouldn't be sad, but happy.
Making the video also has another purpose.
This act of personal commitment in front of a camera is a point of no return.
He's not afraid at all. He's not afraid at all. If there is a hint of fear, he would not be able to continue.
I wasn't worried or scared. I was happy.
But at the last minute, Tawalbeh had second thoughts.
I don't protest God's will. My hour has not yet come to die.
We have seen hesitation in the last moment. Hesitation, wavering, indetermination.
So Murad Tawalbeh's family couldn't celebrate the martyrdom, as is the custom, with festivities.
They really call it a wedding. People come, family, and, friends, and even people whom they don't know, just strangers, come to congratulate them.
But underneath the parents' joy, there are often other feelings.
As a Muslim, I'm happy that he's in paradise, God willing. But at the same time, I'm sad for the loss of my son.
Suicide bombing is not new. During the last days of World War II, a desperate Japan turned to suicide bombers, kamikazes, to try to stave off defeat. An extraordinary interview with a failed kamikaze pilot when we return. You're watching Inside the Mind of a Suicide Bomber on the History Channel. Inside the Mind of a Suicide Bomber on the History Channel. In 1944, the tide of World War II has turned against Japan.
The defense line was completely gone. There was nothing that can stop Americans to come over and destroy whole country and kill everybody off.
To fend off the Americans, the Japanese chose a weapon of last resort. They recruited some 2,200 young men to sacrifice themselves to save the country. Called kamikaze, or divine wind, they were named after the typhoon that destroyed Kublai Khan's fleet in the 13th century, preventing his invasion of Japan. The kamikaze's mission, to drop bombs on enemy ships before crashing their planes into the decks. Toshio Yoshitake was one of them.
It didn't matter if I wanted to go or didn't want to go. I just thought that I had to carry out my job.
Unlike the Palestinian suicide bombers who would strike Israel 50 years later, many of the kamikazes were university graduates from the elite class. Even so, the two suicide groups had something in common.
The group pressure was the main factor in motivating the suicide bombers of the kamikaze to join in and to sacrifice their lives.
Imperial Navy Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi came up with the idea of the kamikaze squads, introducing them in October 1944 during the Battle of the Philippines. When the first group of would-be kamikazes assembled before him, Onishi didn't mince words.
I know that it is much to ask. I don't want to force any one of you to do it. So if any one of you would not like to participate, one step forward. Nobody stepped forward. This is group pressure. To step forward means to be considered a coward by your peers, by yourself.
As a member of a squadron of 18 pilots, Yoshitake was sent to the Philippines that fall. Although they all knew they would be going on suicide missions, none had received any special instruction for the attacks. They had only been trained to attack enemy ships.
We were trained to fly only 10 meters above the surface of the sea and drop bombs. The bombs rebounded off the surface of the water like a stone you might throw. We dropped bombs that way, and we crimed immediately.
On December 12, 1944, Toshio Yoshitake took off on his suicide mission.
I think the sense of responsibility that I had to carry out my task was stronger than fear.
But almost a half hour into his mission, his plane took an enemy hit.
I went down close to the surface of the water right away and evaded the enemy. Then the engine of my plane failed. When I looked forward, I found a black island. I flew toward the island, but my plane crashed on the shore, hit rocks, and turned over.
Although Yoshitake recovered, he did not take part in the Battle of Okinawa in April of 1945. Some 1,000 kamikaze went up against more than 1,300 ships. In wave after wave, the kamikazes kept attacking.
When that plane hit the deck and that big plume of black smoke goes up and the explosions start taking place, the first thing I did was to see how I could look around the smoke to see if I could see another one.
Approximately 5,000 American sailors died as a direct result of the kamikaze attacks during the Battle of Okinawa. The success of the attacks gave the United States second thoughts about the casualties it would suffer if it invaded Japan. It helped persuade President Truman to drop the atom bomb. Today, failed kamikaze Toshio Yoshitake thinks that the deaths of his fellow pilots still have meaning, although he acknowledges that not everyone in Japan agrees.
I often hear people say they wasted their lives for nothing. But I believe more than half the Japanese people think they died for the country.
38 years after the end of World War II, the kamikazes' tactics reappeared, this time in the hands of the Iranian-backed Hezbollah, or the Party of God, in Beirut, Lebanon. Hezbollah is an Islamic fundamentalist militia composed of Shiite Muslims, a sect inspired by the bloody martyrdom of Hussein ibn Ali in the 7th century.
The fact that Hezbollah was the one who introduced this modus operandi is not surprising due to the legacy and heritage of martyrdom in the Shiite tradition.
In 1983, Hezbollah used suicide bombings to try to force U.S. and French peacekeepers out of the country after Israel's invasion of Lebanon a year earlier.
The United States was portrayed by the Shiites, the local Hezbollah, and by its sponsor, Iran, as the great Satan. And they wanted to prove that they are willing to sacrifice their life in order to hurt their utmost enemy.
In April, the U.S. Embassy in Beirut was attacked by a suicide bomber in a truck. 63 people died, including 17 Americans. 6 months later, a suicide bomber crashed a pickup truck loaded with explosives into the U.S. Marine barracks. 241 people were killed and scores of others were injured. A soldier on guard at the Marine barracks got a glimpse of the suicide bomber.
And he said, he was smiling. He was smiling. I mean, it was really unbelievable. A guy driving madly to his death a couple of seconds later, and he was smiling.
For Hezbollah, murder by suicide worked. Within 6 months, the United States and France withdrew their forces from Lebanon. Although Hezbollah was a small and little-known group, its suicide missions gained worldwide attention.
This is a tool for them to prove that they are much, much stronger than they really are.
Inspired by Hezbollah, Islamic fundamentalists would begin using suicide bombing against the Israelis in the 1990s. In an exclusive interview, we'll hear from a Palestinian who built the bombs and picked the targets for a series of devastating suicide attacks inside Israel. You're watching Inside the Mind of a Suicide Bomber on the History Channel. When the first wave of suicide bombings rocked Israel in 1994, the peace process was already well underway. Only months before, in September of 1993, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestinian leader Yasser